I'll never forget the morning they rolled up like some budget version of cops. Two black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of my gate, red and blue lights flashing like a Christmas sale at Walmart. Out jumped four men in matching black uniforms patches stitched with the words, HOA Security Enforcement. They yelled that I was under arrest for non-compliance. Neighbors gasped, curtains fluttered, and Karen, our HOA president in her fire engine red suit, stood smirking like she'd just won the lottery. The whole thing would have been terrifying if their badges hadn't looked like they came from the party store, and one guy's handcuffs still had the price tag dangling. Still, the neighborhood bought the act at least for a moment. What none of them knew, what none of these fakes expected, was that a very different set of sirens was already heading our way. Before I dive into this madness, drop a comment below where are you watching from and what time is it in your part of the world. When I bought this property, I thought I was finally escaping the nonsense of city life. After 25 years of grinding 9 to 5, I'd saved enough to snag a little piece of heaven, a farmhouse with wide porches, rolling acres, and best of all, outside of any HOA jurisdiction. No more newsletters about approved mailbox paint, no more fines for leaving a trash can at the curb too long, and certainly no more Karens telling me which way my blinds should face. Or so I thought. From day one, the HOA that bordered my land had it out for me. Technically, my property wasn't inside their neighborhood. My deed was clear, no covenants, no dues, no obligations. But try explaining that to Karen, the president of Pine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She marched across my driveway the very first week I moved in, clipboard clutched like it was the 10 Commandments, lips pursed so tight I thought her face might crack. You'll need to register with the HOA. Immediately, she declared, like she was serving me court papers. I chuckled, thinking she was joking. Ma'am, I'm not in your HOA. My land sits outside your development. Her smile froze. You ever see someone swallow a lemon whole? That was her expression. Everyone in this community follows the rules. We can't have outsiders lowering property values. That was my first taste of the battle to come. The neighborhood was divided right away. Some folks, mostly retirees who'd had enough of HOA nonsense, welcomed me with fresh pies and friendly waves. They said they envied me for being free from the Queen's iron fist. Others avoided eye contact, whispering when I walked by. Karen, with her perfect blonde hair and blazer that matched her car, warned anyone who dared talk to me too much. I could feel the fear she had cultivated like a school bully who'd been running the playground for years. Within a week, rumors started flying. That man doesn't pay dues. He built without permits. His fence is dangerous. My fence, by the way, was older than her entire HOA. But facts don't matter when gossip is the HOA's favorite weapon. Then the letters started. One arrived in a crisp white envelope stamped with a shiny golden seal, Homeowners Association Compliance Notice. It demanded $1, 200 inches delinquent dues, and threatened further enforcement. I nearly spit out my coffee. Enforcement. On land, they didn't control. I ignored it, tossed it straight in the burn barrel with the junk mail. The next week, another came. This one claimed that my driveway encroached on common property and must be removed. The driveway that had been there since the 1,970 I laughed again, but I noticed something strange. The official seal looked fake. The eagle had uneven wings like it had been drawn by a bored teenager. Still, it rattled me a little. If I knew it was fake, would my neighbors? Or would they see a gold stamp and believe every word? Things escalated fast. I'd see cars idling at the end of my lane, headlights off. A guy with a telephoto lens snapped photos of my barn. Once late at night, a pair of black SUVs cruised slowly past the same ones I'd recognize later during the arrest. At the time, I told myself it was paranoia. Looking back, it was the opening act. The boldest move came 2 weeks later. I was unloading hay bales when Karen strutted up flanked by two young men in matching polos embroidered with HOA security. That's right, she had her own private security force. Their arms were cross tattoos peeking under sleeves like they'd been hired straight from the discount biker bar. Karen cleared her throat dramatically. This is your final warning. Failure to comply will result in serious consequences. I set down a bale, wiped the sweat off my brow, and grinned. Ma'am, the only thing I'm failing to comply with is your imagination. Now, unless you're here to help stack hay, you're trespassing. Her face turned crimson. She snapped her fingers, and the guards leaned in closer, trying to look intimidating. I just laughed. What's next? You going to call the HOA police? Funny how jokes have a way of becoming reality. That night I sat on the porch sipping iced tea, watching the stars. The frogs croaked by the pond, the crickets chirped, and for a moment I thought maybe I could still have peace. But in the distance I saw them again, the unmarked SUVs parked under the trees, waiting, watching. It hit me then Karen wasn't bluffing. She was planning something bigger, something bolder than letters and gossip. Most people would have called the sheriff right away. But here's the thing, I've dealt with bullies my whole life. From middle school hallways to corporate boardrooms, they all operate the same way. They puff up their chests, hope you flinch, and rely on fear to keep their grip. The minute you show you're not scared, they start to unravel. So I made a choice. I wasn't going to cower. I wasn't going to run. If Karen wanted to fight, I'd meet her head on, because the truth has a way of cutting through even the loudest lies. Of course, I didn't know she was crazy enough to stage a full-blown arrest. Not yet. But the storm was gathering, and when it finally broke, it would shake the whole neighborhood to its core. By the time the weekend rolled around, the tension was so thick you could slice it with a butter knife. Neighbors avoided my eyes, kids whispered about the outlaw on the corner lot, and Karen drove past twice a day, glaring like I was a blemish on her perfect suburb. What she didn't know, I had already set up cameras on every inch of my property. Every letter, every confrontation, every shady SUV, I had it all on tape. If she thought she could spin her fantasy into reality, she was about to crash headfirst into cold, hard evidence. I didn't realize how soon I'd need it, because the next morning the HOA cops would come knocking, and I'd be standing there ready to call their bluff. By week 3, my mailbox was fuller than a politician's promise book. Except, instead of campaign flyers, I was drowning in HOA compliance notices. Every envelope bore that shiny crooked seal, as if Karen had ordered a gold stamp machine off the internet and gone wild like a kid with a label maker. One letter declared my barn a fire hazard to the community. Another accused my tractor of being unsightly machinery. My favorite, the one that demanded, I remove my pond because unregulated bodies of water attract pests. You can't make this stuff up. Karen was trying to legislate frogs out of existence. At first I laughed. Each notice was crazier than the last. But after the 5th envelope, laughter gave way to irritation. Not because I believed a word of it, but because I saw the effect it had on my neighbors. Mrs. Parker, who lived across the road, stopped bringing me pies. She muttered something about not wanting to get in trouble. The Wilson kids, who used to play catch near my fence, started darting away whenever they saw me, as if my property carried a curse. The power of paper, even fake paper, was real. Karen knew it. One night I caught movement by the hedgerow. At first I thought it was deer. Then I spotted the glint of a telephoto lens. Someone was photographing my property hiding in the shadows. When I shouted, the figure bolted into the woods, the sound of branches snapping, fading into the night. That wasn't the only time. Over the next week I noticed strange patterns. Cars would idle at the end of my driveway, headlights off. A man in a polo shirt marked HOA security walked down the lane, jotting notes on a clipboard. Every move I made seemed to be under surveillance, as if Karen was building a case file against me. The absurdity of it all only fueled my stubborn streak. I started waving at the watchers, grinning wide just to irritate them. If they were going to spy, I might as well give them a show. One afternoon I stood on the porch in my bathrobe sipping coffee and called out, "Hey, make sure you get my good side." The figure ducked behind a bush, humiliated. Score 1 for me. But Karen wasn't the type to back off. She doubled down. A week later, I was hauling lumber when she stormed onto my property, this time without pretense. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She just marched right up like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, 2 security goons trailing behind. "You are in violation of multiple HOA codes," she barked, waving papers in my face. I dropped the board I was carrying and raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, you do realize this isn't Pine Ridge Estates. Your rules stop at your property line." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "The community disagrees." I laughed. "Lady, your community is about to get laughed out of court if you keep this up." That's when one of her goons stepped forward, puffing his chest. "You better take this seriously. We can make things difficult." His tone dripped with threat, but his shirt collar was still wrinkled from the package. Real tough guy. I leaned in close enough he could smell the sweat and sawdust on me. "Buddy, unless you're here to hammer nails, you're trespassing. Leave before I call the real cops." Karen pulled him back, but not before spitting one last line, "You'll regret defying us." Classic villain talk. Like something straight out of a soap opera. Later that week, more letters arrived, this time claiming I owed late fees for not paying the original fines. $2,300 now. The fake legalese was laughable. Failure to remit payment will result in escalated enforcement measures, including but not limited to detention. Detention. What was this, high school? But here's the part that chilled me. The letters had been slipped directly into my mailbox without postage. That meant someone was walking up to my house late at night, sliding them in. A violation of federal law on top of everything else. I set up trail cameras, motion-activated infrared, the whole works. Within 2 nights, I had my culprit, Karen herself in heels, creeping down my driveway like a cat burglar, shoving envelopes into my box at midnight. The footage was grainy, but the outline of her red blazer was unmistakable. I couldn't resist. The next morning, I printed a still frame from the video and taped it to the mailbox with a sticky note, "Smile for the camera." By noon, she was back at my gate, screaming bloody murder. "You have no right to film me," she shrieked. "On my property, lady, I can film squirrels if I want." Her face turned scarlet. She stomped away, heels sinking in the dirt, muttering about how I'd pay for this. And pay, she meant. Because soon after, things escalated from creepy to dangerous. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I heard engines. 2 black SUVs rolled slowly past my property windows, tinted, no plates visible. They circled twice, then stopped at the far end of the lane. I could see silhouettes inside, talking on radios. For the first time, a shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was turning into impersonation, intimidation, criminal territory. I texted a buddy of mine, a deputy in the sheriff's department, asking him to swing by sometime. He texted back, "Be careful. Some folks don't know where the line is until they're in cuffs." Wise words. But I didn't want to be the guy who ran crying to the law every time Karen sneezed. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness, definitely. I wanted to face her nonsense head-on, prove she couldn't scare me off my land. What I didn't know was that her next move would make every letter, every threat, every SUV seem like child's play. Because Karen wasn't just whispering about calling the cops anymore. She was planning to be the cops. And that's how we arrived at the day the HOA police stormed my gate, fake badges flashing, ready to haul me off for non-compliance. Only they didn't realize who was coming up right behind them. The morning it all went down started deceptively calm. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee, leaning back on the porch swing when the first wail of sirens split the air. Not the steady official kind of sirens that make your stomach drop. No, these sounded tinny, distorted, like somebody's cousin had downloaded a police sounds app and cranked it through busted speakers. Still, the effect was enough. Birds scattered from the trees. Neighbors peeked from their curtains. And before I could set my mug down, 2 matte black SUVs came barreling around the corner lights, flashing from cheap light bars duct taped to the roof. They screeched to a halt right in front of my gate, tires spitting gravel. My first thought, well, I'll be damned. She actually did it. Out spilled 4 men, each dressed in identical black uniforms. The shirts bore patches that read HOA Security Enforcement in bold white letters, though the stitching looked like it had been done by a grandmother with cataracts. Their belts sagged under plastic handcuffs, pepper spray, and radios that weren't even on the same frequency. One guy's holster carried what looked suspiciously like a paintball gun, painted black. I had to bite my lip not to laugh. "Step forward and place your hands behind your back," one of them barked, voice trembling with nervous energy. For what I asked loud enough for my camera to pick up, yes, I'd already set my phone recording, never underestimate the value of evidence. "You are under arrest for non-compliance with community regulations," another declared, unfolding a crumpled piece of paper like it was the Constitution. Behind them, my neighbors had started to gather. Mrs. Parker clutched her pearls. The Wilson kids whispered, eyes wide. And then, like a queen presiding over her loyal subjects, Karen emerged. She stepped from her Lexus in a blazing red suit, clipboard clutched to her chest, a smirk stretching across her face. She looked like she was auditioning for the role of dictator of the cul-de-sac. "It's over, Mr. Thompson," she purred. "You thought you could mock the HOA, but now you'll face the consequences." I leaned casually against the gate. "Karen, if I didn't know better, I'd think you just raided the costume aisle at Party City." Her smirk faltered for half a second before she snapped back, motioning to her faux cops. "Take him in." The 4 imposters advanced, boots crunching on gravel, trying to look intimidating. But their movements weren't in sync, like they hadn't practiced. One guy tripped on the curb and had to jog to catch up. Another kept fiddling with his radio, pretending to talk to headquarters. I raised my voice so every neighbor could hear. "These clowns aren't real cops. Look at their uniforms. No badges, no name tags. And since when does the sheriff's office operate under the name HOA Security Enforcement?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Parker frowned. A few others exchanged uneasy glances. Doubt was setting in. Karen, sensing her grip slipping, screeched, "Don't listen to him. He's dangerous. Arrest him." One of the men pulled out zip ties, clearly planning to bind my hands. Another reached for the gate latch. I stepped forward, calm as a preacher at Sunday service. "Touch that gate and you'll be trespassing. And just so you know, this is all being filmed. Every second. I held up my phone, the little red recording light glowing like a warning beacon. For a split moment, hesitation flickered across their faces. Then Karen snapped again, voice shrill. Do it now. They tried intimidation first. One puffed his chest. Sir, refusal to comply will result in escalated enforcement. I chuckled. Escalated enforcement. What are you going to do, fine me for my mailbox height? The neighbors laughed nervously. A few even nodded. That only enraged Karen more. She stomped her heel into the gravel and jabbed her clipboard toward me like it was a sword. This isn't a game. You're finished today. Her words rang hollow, but her eyes burned with desperation. She had staked everything on this circus act, and I was ruining the performance. The impostors pressed closer. One grabbed the gate, shaking it like he could rattle it off its hinges. Another waved his fake badge in my face. I could see where the laminate was peeling. Last chance, the leader barked, zip ties stretched in his gloved hand. I tilted my head, smiling. Funny thing about last chances, they tend to backfire when you're the one bluffing. Karen shrieked. Enough of this. Break the gate if you have to. That was her fatal mistake. Because the moment those words left her lips, I heard it, the faint, unmistakable whump, whump, whump of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. At first, I thought I imagined it. But the sound grew louder, deeper, vibrating in my chest. Then I noticed the impostors' faces. Their bravado melted into confusion. One even glanced skyward, eyes wide. Behind them, down the lane, came the roar of heavy engines. Real law enforcement SUVs, armored and gleaming, rolled into view. Their lights weren't the flickering knockoffs of Karen's circus. They were the piercing beams of authority, undeniable and real. And above, circling like hawks, 2 helicopters cast shadows across the neighborhood. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Parker clutched her husband's arm. Kids pointed skyward, mouths open. For the first time, Karen's confident smirk faltered. The fake cops froze mid-step. One muttered, "Oh hell." The cavalry had arrived. And suddenly, this little HOA drama wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was about to turn into a full-blown takedown. If you've never stood behind your own gate while 4 wannabe stormtroopers in party store uniforms tried to arrest you, let me tell you, it's equal parts comedy and horror. Comedy because their act was pathetic. Horror because a few neighbors actually believed it. Fear has a funny way of making people ignore common sense. The imposters tightened their little formation, trying to look tough. One guy shook his zip ties like he was about to hogtie a steer. Another clutched a flashlight in broad daylight, clicking it on and off, as if that made him look more official. I raised my hand calmly. "Gentlemen," I said, "you might want to check your jurisdiction. This here's private property. And unless the sheriff suddenly outsourced his duties to HOA security enforcement, you're trespassing." Karen swooped in before they could respond, clipboard raised high. She leaned against the gate, peering at me through the bars like a queen addressing a prisoner. "Don't listen to him, he's a troublemaker. He's a threat to this community." "Karen," I said slowly, "the only thing I'm a threat to is your ego. And judging by the way you've gone full Broadway with this stunt, I'd say I've already won." That line earned me a few chuckles from the neighbors gathering along the sidewalk. Some had phones out now recording. The tide was shifting. My video evidence wasn't going to be the only record of this fiasco. The leader of the fake cops puffed his chest. "Sir, step aside. We've been authorized to use force." "By who? The Ministry of Magic," I quipped. Even the Wilson boy, peeking from behind his mother, snorted at that one. But Karen wasn't laughing. She was red as a fire, hydrant eyes blazing. "Do you think this is funny? Do you think you can defy the rules that keep this neighborhood safe? You will comply." I leaned on the gate, casual as a man on vacation. "Karen, the only thing you've kept safe is your manicure. And honestly, you're overdue for a new shade." That one stung. She jabbed her clipboard at me so hard the papers fluttered like confetti. Enough officers detain him. The fake cops surged forward, rattling the gate. One managed to slip a hand through, reaching for me with all the authority of a mall security guard catching a kid shoplifting bubblegum. I didn't move. I just raised my phone higher, making sure the recording caught everything. Smile for the camera, boys. The internet loves a good comedy. At that moment, the helicopters grew louder. Dust whipped across the street, leaves spiraling into the air. The imposters faltered, looking up as shadows rolled over the cul-de-sac. The real law enforcement convoy pulled closer, SUVs lined bumper-to-bumper, lights flashing in rhythm, sirens howling with a clarity that made Karen's knockoff light bars look like birthday candles. But here's the thing, Karen was so locked into her performance, she didn't even process it. She thought the noise, the dust, the crowd gasping, it was all about her. "See," she shouted, arms wide like she was Moses parting the Red Sea. Even more support has arrived. You can't win, Mr. Thompson. The neighbors looked from her to the approaching convoy, and their expressions said it all. Lady, are you insane? I smirked. Karen, you might want to turn around. She didn't. She doubled down, practically foaming at the mouth. Break this gate, show him we mean business. One of the fake cops kicked the chain link. The padlock rattled but held. Another tried to climb over his boots, scraping metal. I finally dropped my calm tone and let the steel into my voice. You set foot inside this property, you'll regret it. The man froze halfway up, glanced at the helicopters overhead, and climbed back down. His bravado had evaporated. Karen shrieked at him. What are you doing? Arrest him. But by then the real convoy had arrived in full force. 3 armored SUVs screeched to a halt behind the imposters. Doors swung open and out, poured men in full tactical gear, helmets, vests, rifles slung with professional precision. These weren't kids in costume. This was the real deal. Sheriff's Department, drop your weapons, hands in the air. The street erupted in chaos. Neighbors screamed. The imposters panicked, fumbling with their toy radios and zip ties. Karen spun around, finally realizing the cavalry was not hers. This is a mistake, she yelled, voice cracking. They're with me. The SWAT leader ignored her. His team moved like a well-oiled machine, spreading out, covering angles. One shouted again, on the ground, now. The fake cops hesitated, then dropped, like sacks of potatoes, hands scrambling above their heads. Their tough guy act was over in an instant. Karen stood, frozen clipboard trembling in her hands. Her smirk was gone, replaced with sheer panic. Wait, you don't understand. I'm the president of the HOA. I couldn't resist. Congratulations, Karen. You just promoted yourself to head clown in charge. The neighbors burst out laughing, nervous, relieved laughter, but laughter all the same. The fear that had clung to this neighborhood for years cracked like thin ice under the weight of reality. And me, I just kept filming every second, every angle, because I knew this circus wasn't over yet. The standoff had reached its breaking point. Fake cops on the ground, real SWAT barking orders, neighbors capturing it all on their phones. Karen still shrieking, still convinced she could spin this disaster into victory. But she had no idea what was about to happen next. Because the real show hadn't even started. You'd think that the sight of real SWAT fanning out across a cul-de-sac would be enough to end the circus. You'd think a normal person confronted with men in body armor and M4 rifles would fall silent, accept defeat, and maybe pray for leniency. But Karen wasn't built like that. The second the imposters hit the ground and the crowd gasped, she went into full meltdown. Stand up, don't let them intimidate you, she screamed at her fake cops, her red blazer flapping like a battle flag. She whirled toward the real SWAT, pointing her clipboard as though it were Excalibur. This is HOA jurisdiction. You have no authority here. One of the SWAT officers turned his visor toward her. The silence in that moment was almost comical. Authority lady, you're waving a clipboard at men trained to breach barricades. But Karen wasn't done. She snapped her fingers and one of her goons, still kneeling on the pavement, fumbled for something in his belt pouch. To my horror, he pulled out what looked like a stun baton. It crackled weakly, the sound more like a bug zapper than a weapon, but the intent was clear. He staggered to his feet, shouting, "Back off." The SWAT officers pivoted, instantly rifles trained on him. My heart jumped into my throat. This wasn't theater anymore. "Drop it now," one of the real cops thundered. The fake officer's bravado lasted maybe 3 seconds. He glanced at Karen, who screeched, "Don't you dare drop it." Then he looked back at the rifle barrels pointed squarely at his chest. His hand trembled and the baton clattered to the asphalt. The street exhaled. For half a heartbeat, tension eased. But Karen, oh no. Karen refused to surrender the spotlight. She stomped her heel so hard the clipboard shook in her hand. "You cowards, you're supposed to protect me. Arrest him." She jabbed her finger toward me like she was ordering an execution. That's when another of her fake cops decided to get bold. He lunged at the gate again, grabbing the chain with both hands, trying to wrench it free. His buddy joined him, straining, grunting, pretending they were in some action movie. The padlock groaned, metal squealing under the force. My phone captured every second, my heart pounding, not from fear but disbelief. Were these idiots really about to break into private property in front of an entire SWAT unit? "Back away from the gate," the command rang out again. But adrenaline does strange things to people. One of the imposters, maybe desperate to prove himself, pulled what I swear was a spray-painted airsoft pistol from his holster. It wasn't even convincing up close. But from a distance, to a crowd of neighbors and jittery SWAT, it looked like a weapon. My stomach dropped. The officer closest to him shouted, "Gun, drop it." Time slowed. The imposter raised the airsoft pistol halfway, then froze as a blinding spotlight from the helicopter overhead zeroed in on him. Dust swirled, sirens screamed, and suddenly his whole body sagged. He dropped the toy with a clunk that echoed in the silence. Hands on his head, he fell to his knees. Now the neighborhood was in full chaos. Kids cried, parents pulled them back. Mrs. Parker fainted right into her husband's arms. Neighbors who had once whispered about my non-compliance now shouted, "Get them out of here." And through it all, Karen screeched like a banshee. "This is harassment. These are my officers. I demand you arrest that man." She pointed at me again, but her voice cracked under the weight of panic. I couldn't resist. I cupped my hands and shouted over the noise, "Karen, your little HOA Halloween party is over. Go home." The laughter that rippled through the crowd was the final nail in her coffin. Her authority, her intimidation, her entire little empire crumbling in real time. But Karen wasn't about to go quietly. She shoved past one of the SWAT officers, clipboard raised, as if she might strike me through the bars. "This is my neighborhood. You don't belong here. She didn't get to finish. The officer gently but firmly grabbed her wrist, twisting the clipboard free. Papers scattered like leaves fluttering to the ground. The sight of HOA fines and fake summons swirling in the wind was poetic justice. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the officer warned. Karen thrashed. "Don't touch me. I'm the president." "Not anymore," someone in the crowd muttered, and laughter erupted again. The fake cops were now lined on their stomachs, hands zip-tied behind their backs, ironically with their own equipment. The SWAT team moved with smooth efficiency, securing weapons, or rather toys cataloging evidence. One officer approached me at the gate. "Sir, are you all right?" I nodded, though. My blood was still buzzing. "Better than them?" I said, gesturing to the pile of imposters groaning on the pavement. Karen heard me and shrieked, "This isn't over. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you." I shook my head. "Karen, the only thing you're qualified to sue is your tailor for that blazer." Even the SWAT officer cracked a smirk at that. But just when I thought the worst was over, Karen made one last desperate move. She darted toward the fake cops, as though she could rally them back to her cause. Her heels slipped on the gravel, but she pressed on, shrieking about sovereign HOA authority, like a general who didn't realize the war was lost. The officers intercepted her, hands up, blocking her path. She shoved one hard. That was it, the final straw. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for obstruction," the SWAT leader declared. The crowd erupted in cheers. Phones captured every angle as Karen was spun around, her hands cuffed behind her back, not with toy zip ties but with real steel. Her scream echoed through the cul-de-sac. "I'm the president." And just like that, the HOA queen was dethroned in front of her entire kingdom. For me, behind that gate, it was the sweetest victory I'd ever tasted. But I knew this wasn't the end. Because once the dust settled, the truth about this fake HOA police force would come out, and it was uglier than anyone could have imagined. And as much as I enjoyed seeing Karen in cuffs, I had no idea how deep her conspiracy ran, or how close it had come to real disaster. If you've ever heard a helicopter hovering low over your house, you know the sound sticks to your bones. It's not just noise, it's pressure. A deep pounding thump that rattles windows, shakes your chest, and makes every dog in the county lose its mind. That morning, as Karen was dragged backward, kicking and screaming, the rotors grew louder. Two massive black helicopters loomed overhead, spotlights cutting through the dust storm they churned up. Leaves swirled, neighbors shielded their eyes, and kids clutched their parents' legs in awe and terror. The imposters, still face down on the asphalt, twisted their necks to stare up at the sky, realization dawning on their faces. Whatever script they'd rehearsed in their heads, it hadn't included this. I admit, even I was stunned. I'd expected the sheriff, maybe a couple deputies. But seeing SWAT SUVs backed by helicopters circling like hawks, that was a whole new level of surreal. For once, I wasn't the only star of the HOA show. This was a full-blown production, and Karen's HOA police force had just been upstaged. The helicopters dropped lower, one circling wide, the other holding steady over the cul-de-sac. Through the glare of the spotlight, I could just make out figures inside, door gunners with rifles braced, scanning the scene like they were in a combat zone. The imposters whimpered into the pavement. SWAT officers shouted clear commands over the roar. "Stay down! Don't move!" Their voices cut like steel, practiced and precise. Karen, however, refused to grasp reality. "This is illegal," she screeched, voice almost swallowed by the rotors. "I am the HOA president. You have no authority over me." One officer, standing a foot taller than her, didn't even blink. "Ma'am, you're under arrest. Stay still." Her shrill reply was carried away in the wind. The neighbors were in shock. Some clutched their phones so tight their knuckles turned white, others whispered in disbelief, Is this really happening? Are those military helicopters? I could see the shift happening in real time. Fear had once kept them silent under Karen's thumb, but now that same fear was dissolving, replaced with something new: relief. Relief that the monster they'd tiptoed around was finally being dragged into the light. Mr. Parker, holding his fainted wife upright, muttered, "I knew she was power-hungry, but this..." She lost her mind. I raised my phone higher, catching every angle. My voice carried over the chaos. This is what happens when you let bullies run unchecked. They start thinking they're kings, or in Karen's case, queens with fake cops. Laughter rippled nervously through the crowd. Then in the chaos, one of the fake cops tried a final act of defiance. Still zip-tied, he rolled onto his back and shouted up at the helicopters, "We're the real law here." The spotlight snapped down on him like God's flashlight. The beam was so bright he flinched, squeezing his eyes shut. "Shut it down," a SWAT officer barked, kicking his legs apart to keep him pinned. The man whimpered, voice cracking. The swagger was gone. Karen shrieked at the sight, "Don't you dare touch my officers, they're HOA certified." I couldn't help myself. I hollered back, "Certified by who? The Dollar Store Academy?" Even one of the armored officers smirked under his visor. By now the noise was overwhelming. Dust whipped into my yard. The American flag I kept by the porch snapped violently in the wind, but I stood firm, hands gripping the gate, watching the farce unravel. The SWAT commander, broad-shouldered and calm, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. These individuals were impersonating law enforcement. They are now in custody. There is no danger to the community." The words landed like a thunderclap. Neighbors who had once whispered about me, who had avoided eye contact, now turned their cameras on Karen and her imposters. For the first time, they weren't afraid. They were outraged. A mother near the back yelled, "You scared our kids." Another man added, "You could have gotten us all killed." Karen's eyes darted wildly. She hadn't expected the tide to turn so fast. Her kingdom of fear was collapsing right before her eyes. Then came the moment I'll never forget. The commander raised his hand, and through the helicopter's loudspeaker boomed a single order: secure the area. SWAT moved with mechanical precision. Officers swept the SUVs, pried open trunks, and pulled out duffel bags filled with cheap uniforms, fake badges, and laminated papers stamped with Karen's beloved gold seal. Evidence spilled across the street, proof of the whole charade. The crowd gasped. One little boy whispered, "It's all fake." And that was it. The illusion shattered completely. Karen howled, "No, those are official documents. You can't." The commander cut her off. "Ma'am, this ends now." In that instant, the absurdity of it all hit me. A suburban HOA president had tried to stage her own private police force, complete with fake uniforms, toy weapons, and bogus arrests, all to drag me into compliance with rules that didn't even apply to my land. And now, with helicopters shaking the sky and armed officers hauling her screaming into custody, the entire neighborhood saw the truth: she wasn't a leader. She was a tyrant who finally tripped over her own power grab. I leaned on the gate, letting the dust wash over me, and spoke loud enough for my camera and every neighbor to hear, and that, folks, is why I don't join HOAs. The cheer that erupted almost drowned out the rotors. Almost. Because even as Karen was shoved into the back of a police SUV, I couldn't shake the feeling there was still more to uncover. Who funded her fake cops? Who let this scheme get so far? The sound of the helicopters faded into the distance, but the questions roared louder than ever. And I had a feeling the answers were about to get a whole lot uglier. When the dust began to settle, you could feel the weight of authority shift. For weeks, Karen had strutted around like a dictator, lording over terrified neighbors with her clipboard and phony citations. But now, the real deal had arrived, and the contrast was night and day. The SWAT commander barked orders that cut through the roar of the helicopters. "Secure the perimeter, check the vehicles, keep the civilians back." His voice wasn't loud, it was steady, controlled, and full of real authority. You could tell immediately who was in charge. The imposters, still face down on the asphalt, whimpered as officers knelt on their backs, securing zip ties. Their cheap radios squawked uselessly, one still tuned to a local FM station. The one who'd waved the airsoft pistol earlier now sobbed openly, begging, "I didn't know. She said it was legal." Karen, however, refused to quit. Even in cuffs, she twisted around like a cat in a cage. "You don't understand. I am the law here. These men are legitimate. She jerked her head at me. "He's the criminal." The commander didn't flinch. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for conspiracy, impersonating law enforcement, and obstruction of justice. Stay quiet." Karen howled like a banshee. "I'm the president of this hoe." I couldn't resist. "And now you're the vice president of making terrible life choices." That got a few chuckles from the crowd. Even one officer shook his head like he was trying not to laugh. The real SWAT moved fast. Within minutes, they had the fake SUVs popped open, outspilled duffel bags full of fake uniforms, laminated citations, rolls of duct tape, and more zip ties than a hardware store clearance rack. One officer held up a clipboard almost identical to Karen's, except this one had arrest warrants scrawled in Comic Sans. Good God, I muttered into my phone, still filming. They actually thought this would work. The neighbors gasped at each new discovery. The Wilson boy whispered, "They were going to take you away." His mother hugged him tighter. Mr. Parker shook his head, muttering to anyone who'd listen, all this just to make a man mow his lawn their way. This neighborhood lost its mind. But the real gut punch came when the SWAT officer announced loudly for the record, these individuals were paid operatives. We found payment envelopes in the vehicle's cash in Karen Morgan's handwriting. The crowd erupted. A dozen phones zoomed in on Karen, her face pale as chalk. She screeched, "That's not mine, those are planted." The commander ignored her. He turned toward me at the gate. "Sir, we'll need your statement, but rest assured, you are not in any trouble. You're the victim here." Victim didn't even begin to cover it. I'd been stalked, harassed, photographed, threatened, and nearly zip-tied in front of my own house, all because I dared to live outside the HOA's clutches. "Happy to cooperate," I said, my voice steady but laced with sarcasm. "And just so you know, I've got every minute of this mess on video." The officer nodded. "That's going to help a lot." Meanwhile, the imposters were marched one by one to the back of real patrol vehicles. Their tough guy swagger was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and bowed heads. One muttered, "We thought she had authority." Another snapped, "She said the sheriff was in on it." Karen shrieked, "Stop talking, don't say a word, I'll handle this." The officer beside her snorted, "Ma'am, the only thing you'll be handling is a court date." The neighbors laughed outright this time. Laughter, the very sound Karen had spent years stamping out, now filled the air. It was like watching a dam burst. I walked up to the gate, careful not to cross the line. My phone still recording, I called out for the crowd to hear. "Folks, let this be a reminder. Real authority doesn't need clipboards or fake badges. It doesn't need intimidation or rumors. It stands on truth." The cheer that went up startled even me. Neighbors clapped, some whistled. Mrs. Parker finally revived, dabbed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank God." Karen spat toward me, her voice breaking. "You think you've won. This isn't over." I raised my brows. "Karen, the only thing that's not over is your legal bills." Even the SWAT commander cracked the faintest grin before turning back to his men. By the time the helicopters peeled off, the imposters were secured, Karen was locked in a squad car, and the neighborhood had witnessed something none of us would ever forget. The power dynamic was shattered. The queen bee had been smoked out of her hive, and the swarm she'd once controlled was suddenly free. As the last of the imposters was hauled away, I caught the eye of the Wilson boy again. He whispered, "You're not the bad guy." I crouched down, smiling at him through the gate. "No, son. Sometimes the loudest voice isn't the right one. Remember that." But even as the adrenaline began to fade, I knew this story wasn't done. The arrests were just the beginning. What about the fake documents, the money, the scheme itself? Who else had helped Karen pull this off? I leaned back against my fence, the dust finally settling my phone, buzzing with neighbors already sending me clips of what they'd recorded. This HOA war had been broadcast to the world, and I had the receipts. Karen had played her last card, and the real authorities had slammed it back in her face. But the aftermath, the fallout, was going to be just as wild. And believe me, I was ready for it. The following days felt like living inside a headline. By the next morning, the story had already hit local news. Fake HOA police arrested in bizarre standoff, real SWAT intervenes. A grainy shot of Karen, red blazer, wrinkled and hair flying as she was shoved into a patrol car, was plastered on every channel. Neighbors whispered that she looked more like a soap opera villain than a president. The neighborhood, once so quiet, was buzzing. People stopped me at the gas station, the feed store, even the diner in town. "Aren't you the guy with the HOA cops?" they'd ask, half laughing, half incredulous. My porch became a revolving door of neighbors dropping off casseroles, pies, and even a six-pack or two. Folks who had avoided me out of fear now wanted to shake my hand. It was surreal. But beneath the relief and laughter, there was a darker thread winding through everything, the sheer scope of what Karen had attempted. When the sheriff's office released their preliminary report, jaws dropped. Turns out the imposters weren't just neighborhood toughs. They were hired muscle recruited from a nearby town. Karen had paid them cash out of the HOA's discretionary fund, which was supposed to go toward landscaping and pool maintenance. She'd even ordered their uniforms from an online tactical gear site, altering the patches to read HOA Security Enforcement. The fake citations designed on her home computer, complete with a counterfeit seal she'd downloaded off a stock image site. She'd spent weeks preparing for her police raid, all in the name of forcing me to comply. Neighbors were furious. At the emergency HOA meeting held in the clubhouse 2 nights later, the anger boiled over. People shouted, slammed fists on tables, demanded refunds for every dime she'd stolen. "I pay my dues for community safety, not for Karen to play dictator," one man yelled. "She put all of us in danger," another cried. The board members, pale and sweating, resigned on the spot. Nobody wanted to be associated with the scandal. The HOA, once feared like a shadow government, was crumbling in real time. Karen herself wasn't seen again. Rumor had it she'd been denied bail. The charges stacked up like bricks: conspiracy, impersonation of law enforcement, misuse of funds, harassment. But what struck me most was how quickly the fear she'd cultivated evaporated. The same neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid my gaze now gathered at my fence line, swapping stories and laughing about the whole fiasco. Mrs. Parker, who had fainted during the standoff, brought me another pie. She apologized through tears, saying I let her scare me into silence. Never again. I told her not to worry. Fear makes people do strange things. But seeing the relief on her face, I realized this was bigger than me. The whole neighborhood had been under her thumb for years, and now they were free. The news dug deeper. Investigative reporters uncovered a pattern. Karen had been inflating fines, fabricating infractions, even using HOA funds to renovate her kitchen. People started coming forward with horror stories. Families fined thousands for lawn gnomes, for kids' bikes left outside, for painting shutters the wrong shade of beige. The fake police stunt wasn't the beginning. It was the grand finale of a long con. And while the rest of the world laughed at the absurdity of HOA cops, we knew the truth. It could have ended far worse. Those toy weapons might have gotten someone shot. Those fake arrests could have turned into real violence. It sent a chill down my spine to think how close it had come. In the weeks that followed, the HOA dissolved. The remaining funds, what hadn't been siphoned into Karen's schemes, were redistributed to the homeowners. The pool gates were chained shut, the newsletter stopped arriving, and the clipboard dictatorship was over. As for me, life got quieter. The cameras I'd installed stayed up, but now they mostly caught deer, raccoons, and the occasional neighbor dropping off cookies. The SUVs stopped circling. The only officers patrolling my property now were barn cats chasing mice. But I'll admit, sometimes at night when the wind was still, I'd hear the phantom echo of those rotors in my head. The thump, thump, thump that had saved me, exposed her, and changed the neighborhood forever. One evening, about a month after the fiasco, I was sipping iced tea on the porch when the Wilson boy walked up. He shifted nervously, hands in his pockets. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry I thought you were the bad guy. Mom said we shouldn't talk to you, but you stood up to her. Nobody else did." I smiled, ruffling his hair. "That's all right, son. The truth has a way of getting out sooner or later." He grinned, then asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you think she'll come back?" I shook my head. "Not in the way you remember her." And with that, he smiled, satisfied, and ran off to play. The neighborhood was healing, slowly but surely. But me, I couldn't help wondering if one woman with a clipboard and a power complex could take things this far. How many other HOAs across the country were pulling the same tricks, just with less helicopters involved? That thought stayed with me. And I knew one thing for sure: my story wasn't the only one worth telling. Because bullies come in many forms. And sometimes they wear a red blazer and call themselves president. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of relief and reckoning. Relief because Karen and her HOA police were gone, locked away behind bars where their fake uniforms couldn't intimidate anyone ever again. Reckoning because the community had to face a hard truth: they had allowed fear, gossip, and one woman's power trip to dictate their lives for far too long. The legal process was brutal for her. Court documents revealed everything: the bank withdrawals, the online orders for uniforms, the fake stamps she'd ordered from overseas. The DA laid it all out like a play-by-play, and every neighbor watched the coverage, jaws slack. "She really thought she was untouchable," Mrs. Parker said one afternoon as we stood by the fence. "I think part of me believed it too." I nodded. That's the trick with bullies. They act like they've already won. Makes everyone too scared to call their bluff. And I'd seen enough of Karen to know she thrived on that fear. Without it, she was nothing more than a loud woman with a clipboard. The HOA itself collapsed within weeks. No board, no funds, no bylaws. Just a group of homeowners learning how to live without being policed for the color of their shutters. Funny thing, the neighborhood didn't fall apart. Lawns stayed trimmed, kids still rode bikes, and nobody's property value collapsed into oblivion. If anything, people looked freer, happier. We even had a block party, a real one, not the approved kind. Karen used to micromanage with sign-up sheets and penalties for late arrivals. Folks brought barbecue baked beans and cold beer. For the first time in years, laughter rang out across the cul-de-sac without the sound of Karen's heels clicking in disapproval. Neighbors who'd once avoided me now pulled up chairs beside mine. Some apologized, others simply said thank you. And I realized something: I wasn't just fighting for myself when I stood at that gate. I'd been fighting for them too, even if they didn't know it yet. As for me, my life settled back into a rhythm. I worked my land, tended my barn, and enjoyed the quiet that came with being free from constant harassment. But the memory of that morning never left me. The flashing lights, the fake cops, the real SWAT swooping in like avenging angels. There were nights I'd sit on the porch, the cicadas buzzing, and replay the sound of those rotors in my head. That noise had been chaos, but it had also been justice descending from the sky. And it reminded me how thin the line is between farce and tragedy. One wrong move, one panic trigger finger, and that story could have ended very differently. Karen's sentencing came 3 months later. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors filled every bench, some whispering prayers, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The judge laid it out bluntly. You abused your position of trust. You endangered lives. You fabricated authority. And you did it all for control. Karen tried one last plea. She rambled about preserving property values and defending the community, but her voice wavered, and no one believed her anymore. The sentence, years in prison, fines so steep she'd never pay them off. When the gavel fell, the room erupted in applause. People hugged. Mrs. Parker actually wept. For once, it wasn't fear binding the community together, it was relief, solidarity, and maybe even a little joy. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high. Not because I wanted glory, but because I knew the truth had finally prevailed. Back at home, life felt simpler again. The cameras I'd set up still watched the driveway, but mostly they caught raccoons tipping over trash bins. I kept the padlock on my gate shiny and secure, not because I expected another fake raid, but because it reminded me that standing firm matters. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, the Wilson boy rode up on his bike. He stopped by my fence, grinning. "Hey, Mr. Thompson," he called. "You're like a hero." I laughed. "Son, I'm just a guy who refused to move." He nodded, satisfied, and pedaled off. But his words stuck with me. Maybe he was right in a way. Not a hero in capes and comic books, but a reminder that ordinary folks can push back against bullies and win. And in the end, that was enough. Because for the first time since I'd moved into my little slice of heaven, peace finally felt permanent. Looking back, I've learned something I wish I could have told myself months earlier: bullies only have the power we give them. Whether it's a kid on the playground, a boss at work, or a self-appointed HOA president with a god complex, their strength comes from fear. They puff themselves up, wave their authority around, and hope no one calls their bluff. But the truth: the moment someone stands tall, their house of cards collapses. I didn't plan to be the one to face down Karen's fake police force. I just knew I wasn't going to let intimidation define my life. And when I refused to bow, others found their courage too. My neighbors saw what happens when you replace silence with laughter, fear with defiance, and lies with truth. It's a lesson I think applies far beyond my little corner of the world. Stand firm, document everything, and don't be afraid to shine a light on corruption. Because sometimes justice comes in the form of a gavel, and sometimes it comes thundering down from the sky with rotor blades. So, if you've ever faced your own HOA, Karen, or dealt with someone abusing power, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, share your story, and let others know they're not alone. And if you want more wild, true-to-life HOA drama like this, don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, the stories only get crazier from here.